It was a warm Friday evening as Dr. Aaliyah James, one of the city's youngest and most dedicated criminal investigators, prepared for a relaxing evening out. After a long week, she looked forward to unwinding, maybe catching a movie or having dinner with friends. But her plans took an unexpected turn as she walked through a downtown parking lot to her car. The lot was almost empty, and Aaliyah was aware of her surroundings, just as she had been trained to be. She was approaching her car when she noticed a police officer glaring at her from across the lot. She ignored him, assuming he was simply on his regular rounds. But she soon heard his heavy boots thumping in her direction. "Hey, you!" he barked, startling her. She looked up to find him marching toward her with a scowl on his face. His name tag read, Officer Connolly, and he had a harsh, unforgiving look that she'd seen before in the faces of many who had their minds made up before hearing any facts. "Yes," she replied, maintaining her composure. "What are you doing around here?" His tone was accusatory, even aggressive. His hand hovered over his holster as if he were ready to draw his weapon at any moment. "I'm just heading to my car," Aaliyah replied, holding up her keys as she glanced at her vehicle a few yards away. "Do you live around here?" Connolly demanded, his face tightening with suspicion. Aaliyah could sense the disdain radiating off him, but she remained calm. "Yes, officer, I do. I live just a few blocks away." "That right?" Connolly sneered, his eyes narrowing. "Got any ID to prove it?" Aaliyah's patience thinned, but she complied, reaching into her bag for her wallet. The last thing she wanted was to cause a scene, even though she could feel her heart racing. She held out her ID, silently hoping this would be enough to satisfy him. Connolly snatched it from her hand and examined it with narrowed eyes. "Aaliyah James, huh? Fancy name. Where do you work?" "I work for the city," Aaliyah answered. It was true, but she left out the details. She had a hunch that revealing her full title would complicate things, and not in a way that would benefit her. "Is that so?" Connolly's tone dripped with skepticism. He stared at her ID a moment longer, before tossing it back to her with a scoff. "Well, you don't look like you belong around here." Aaliyah felt her pulse quicken with irritation. She had been through scenarios like this before, but it never got easier. She chose her words carefully, keeping her tone even. "Officer, I have every right to be here. I'm just on my way home." Connolly took a step closer, closing the distance between them. "Listen, you may have the right to be here, but people like you always seem to cause trouble." "People like me?" The phrase hung in the air, loaded with unspoken bias. She held her ground, meeting his gaze with a steady look of her own. She wanted to walk away, but something told her that wouldn't end well. "You should know better than to mouth off to an officer," he sneered, his hand moving again toward his holster. The situation was spiraling, and Aaliyah's instincts, honed over years in her field, told her that Connolly wasn't going to let this go without a reason. Just as she prepared to respond, Connolly's patience snapped. He lunged forward, roughly grabbing her arm. Aaliyah gasped at the sudden force, her reflexes kicking in. She tried to shake him off, but he tightened his grip, pushing her against the side of her car. "Is this really necessary?" she managed to say, wincing at the pressure on her arm. "Necessary," Connolly sneered. "I'm making sure the streets are safe from people like you." Aaliyah's mind raced, her instincts telling her to stay calm. She knew this would escalate quickly if she resisted, so she bit her tongue, letting him have his moment. Connolly's grip only tightened, and she could feel the bruising pain in her arm as he forced her to stay pinned against the car. Finally, he released her with a shove, his face inches from hers. "Next time, watch yourself," he growled. Aaliyah took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Officer Connolly," she began, choosing her words carefully. "You don't know who I am, and you don't know my story. But I'll tell you this. You'll regret what you just did." Connolly scoffed, amusement flickering across his face. "Is that a threat?" "It's a promise," Aaliyah replied, her voice cold and controlled. With that, she adjusted her jacket, concealing her official badge, and turned to leave without another word. Little did Officer Connolly know that the tables would soon turn in ways he couldn't imagine. Aaliyah returned home, her heart pounding with anger and a sense of injustice she hadn't felt in a long time. She replayed the encounter in her mind, the memory of Officer Connolly's sneering face and bruising grip etched into her memory. But instead of letting it fester, she decided to let her actions speak louder than words. The following Monday, Aaliyah walked into the city courthouse, her badge proudly displayed on her jacket. She was scheduled to lead a briefing for a case involving police misconduct, and as she scanned the room, she recognized a familiar face among the officers present. Officer Connolly. He was seated in the back, his expression shifting from boredom to shock the moment he saw her. His face turned pale as he realized who she was. Not just another civilian he could intimidate, but a high-ranking criminal investigator with the power to impact his career. The room settled, and Aaliyah began her presentation, addressing issues of discrimination, abuse of power, and the responsibility that came with wearing a badge. Her words carried an extra weight, each point resonating not just with Connolly, but with every officer in the room. As officers of the law, you hold the power to protect or harm, to uplift or demean, she said, her gaze directly locking onto Connolly. We're here to serve, not intimidate, and we're here to uphold justice, not only when it's convenient, but even when it challenges us. A murmur rippled through the room as Connolly shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes cast down. He seemed to understand that Aaliyah was speaking directly to him, her words a pointed reminder of the encounter they had just days before. After the briefing, Aaliyah remained at the front of the room, answering questions and engaging in discussion. As the crowd began to disperse, Connolly approached her hesitantly, his usual bravado nowhere to be seen. "Investigator James," he began, his voice quieter than she'd expected. "Yes, Officer Connolly," she replied, maintaining a professional tone, though a flicker of satisfaction crossed her face. She was fully aware of the discomfort he felt, but she wasn't going to offer him any relief. I didn't realize," he trailed off, visibly struggling to find the words. "You didn't realize what, Officer Connolly?" Aaliyah's voice was steady, but there was a steely edge beneath it. Connolly cleared his throat. "I didn't know who you were. I misjudged you. It was unprofessional." Aaliyah crossed her arms, her gaze unyielding. "You misjudged me because of what you assumed about me, based solely on my appearance and where I happened to be." Connolly looked down, the shame evident on his face. "You're right. I'm sorry." Aaliyah took a moment, allowing his apology to hang in the air. "Sorry doesn't erase what you did, but I hope you understand now that you can't afford to make those assumptions. Not if you want to serve the public fairly and honorably." Connolly nodded, his face flushed with embarrassment. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, another officer approached. Chief Owens, the head of their department. "Investigator James, fantastic job with the briefing," Owens said, clapping her on the shoulder. "And Connolly, I'm glad you're here. There's something we need to discuss regarding last Friday." Connolly's face fell as he glanced at Aaliyah, understanding that her position was far more influential than he had initially realized. Chief Owens led him away, and Aaliyah watched as they disappeared down the hall, feeling a sense of closure and justice. Over the next few weeks, word spread throughout the department about the incident. Connolly was suspended pending an investigation, and Aaliyah's story became a powerful example of the biases and abuses that the city was determined to root out. Her experience resonated, inspiring others to reflect on their behavior and biases, fostering an environment where real change was possible. For Aaliyah, the encounter with Officer Connolly was more than just a confrontation. It was a reminder of the responsibility she held, not just as an investigator, but as a symbol of resilience and dignity for others in her community. She hadn't sought revenge, but rather justice, knowing that her position allowed her to challenge the system from within. And as she continued her work, she felt a renewed sense of purpose, determined to ensure that everyone, regardless of their background, was treated with the respect they deserved. In the end, karma had indeed hit hard, not through vengeance, but through the unwavering power of integrity. Aaliyah's victory wasn't in punishing Officer Connolly, but in standing firm against prejudice, proving that justice, when wielded correctly, could bring about lasting change.